Before 1865, life was hard for many people, especially for people of African American descent. Back then, African Americans were labeled as property and were sold in exchange to slave owners that, for the most part, treated them poorly. They were forced to do manual labor for an excessive amount of hours and were kept in very poor conditions. They did not have rights to education, to own property, or to have a life of their own.
Life changed drastically from 1865 to the 1950s and 1960s, but for African Americans, life was still a struggle. Businesses, schools, transportation, such as buses or trains, bathrooms, and even water fountains were separated by the color of your skin. African Americans had to live in separate neighborhoods and work different jobs than the whites. This practice of separating people by the color of their skin is called segregation.
Due to the segregation at the time, a new movement awakened called the Civil Rights Movement. Civil rights are basic rights that every citizen has under the laws of the government. Civil rights for every person means that regardless of gender, skin, color, religion, nationality, age, disability, or religion, a person should not be discriminated against.
This civil rights movement consisted of African American people fighting for the same rights as their fellow white counterparts. Significant court cases at the time fought against these discriminating practices, such as Brown versus the Board of Education, which concluded that separate but equal education facilities were inherently unequal and opened the door to integration of both whites and blacks in schools together.
During this time period, there was a 15-year-old African American girl named Claudette Colvin that lived in Montgomery, Alabama. One day, on her way back home from school, she was sitting in the black section of a bus when she was arrested after she refused to give up her seat to a white passenger.
Claudette Colvin was a knowledgeable student that was educated on the gruesome history of African Americans and slavery within the United States. Indeed, even though African Americans during the 1950s were not enslaved legally and knew what the idea of freedom meant, they were now labeled as separate but equal with whites. Claudette Colvin knew this was something that had to change. She states that when you have a gut feeling that things aren't right and unfair, you should speak out. If you have to stand up alone, stand up alone.
Before and after her arrest, Colvin continuously worked collectively with Rosa Parks, who was the secretary of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, also known as the NAACP.
A couple of months after Claudette Colvin's bus ride incident, the president of the NAACP, E.D. Nixon, introduced the idea to boycott the Montgomery bus system and use Colvin's arrest as the reason to boycott. In effect, they decided that they should not use Colvin as the figurehead because her skin was too dark and she was merely 15 years old, as society would have seen her as an unreliable source. Due to the fact that Rosa Parks and Claudette Colvin had been communicating, it was decided that Rosa Parks would be a good icon for the NAACP to use. She was a very well-known and respected adult, had a skin texture that was the kind of people associate with the middle class, and she was an inherently impressive person.
There are many reasons why Claudette Colvin has been pretty much forgotten. After Colvin's arrest, she found herself shunned by parts of her community. She experienced various difficulties and became pregnant. She hardly ever told her story once she had moved to New York City. In her new community, hardly anyone was talking about integration. Instead, most people were talking about Black enterprises, Black power, and Malcolm X.
Despite these personal challenges she faced, Claudette Colvin was one of 4 women to serve as plaintiffs in Browder versus Gale. This case successfully overturned the bus segregation laws in Montgomery and Alabama.
Ultimately, if it was not for Claudette Colvin, the NAACP probably wouldn't have gotten the idea to boycott the bus system in the first place, meaning Rosa Parks probably wouldn't have been the well-known historical figurehead she is known as today.